My name is Deborah Mercer, and I am 46 years old. For 3 years, I gave $1,200 every single month to a church in Marietta, Georgia. The money went into envelopes marked Mission Fund, dropped into a collection basket every first Sunday of the month, and I never once questioned where it went. Our pastor drove a new Escalade every 12 months. The food pantry we ran out of the East Hallway, the ministry I helped stock every third Saturday, the one that fed 47 families in our zip code, ran out of supplies every February without fail. And every February, Pastor Raymond Coles stood at the pulpit and told us God was testing our faithfulness. He told us the testing had produced $647,000. He just did not tell us who was being tested. What I found, with a CPA named Marcus Webb and 4 years of church financial records that the IRS requires every nonprofit to make publicly available, was a mission fund that had never been set up as a church account. Not once. Not ever. Every dollar donated under that name had been deposited directly into accounts Raymond Coles controlled personally, a Wells Fargo business account registered to a private LLC in his wife's maiden name, and a third account in the Cayman Islands that federal investigators identified 14 months into the case. The Department of Justice recovered $431,000. Raymond Coles was sentenced to 41 months in federal prison. The IRS permanently revoked the church's 501c3 tax-exempt status. The food pantry reopened 6 months after the investigation concluded. It has not run out of supplies once since then. This is a calm story, the kind that does not announce itself as a revenge story until you understand what was taken and what was recovered. It is built entirely on a publicly available IRS document and 2 people who decided to read it. I joined Grace Covenant Fellowship in Marietta, Georgia in the spring of 2019. I am a school counselor in Cobb County. I have been in that role for 14 years, and I had been raised in a church-going household in Augusta and spent my adult years moving between denominations the way some people move between neighborhoods, looking for the particular quality of community that feels both familiar and chosen. Grace Covenant was the first place in a long time that felt like both. The building was a converted warehouse on a 2-lane road south of the city center, the kind of structure that should not have worked as a sanctuary and somehow worked completely. The ceilings were high and industrial, crossed with exposed wooden beams, and on Sunday mornings the choir took up the full eastern wall, and the sound filled the space with a resonance that made the acoustics feel less like an accident and more like intention. The pews were cushioned in worn burgundy fabric that had been there long enough to carry the permanent warmth of 10 years of Sunday mornings. The whole room smelled of candle wax and furniture polish, and, faintly, the coffee someone was always brewing in the fellowship hall just beyond the interior wall. When the choir opened the service, I felt the sound through the cushion beneath me. I am not a person who cries easily. I cried the first Sunday I sat in that building, not because anything extraordinary happened, but because the room felt like arriving somewhere you had not known you were looking for. Raymond Coles had been the senior pastor at Grace Covenant for 9 years before I joined. He was 52 years old, broad-shouldered, with the particular presence of a man who had spent decades learning how to hold a room, not through volume, but through pace and selection. He knew which sentence to slow down on. He knew how to find the person in the congregation who looked uncertain and speak directly at them without appearing to do so. He was, in every technical sense of the word, a gifted communicator. I say this not to excuse anything that came after, but because understanding the mechanism of the fraud requires understanding first how completely the trust was constructed. The food pantry was the ministry I became most involved with in my first year. It operated out of a storage room off the East Hallway, stocked by volunteer teams on the third Saturday of each month, and served 47 families in the surrounding zip code, grocery staples, fresh produce when the budget allowed, personal care items, diapers. The pastor had launched it 7 years before I arrived, and it had the quality of a ministry that had been cared for consistently enough to become institutional. Families depended on it. Some had been coming since it opened. I joined the stocking team in June of my first year. Third Saturdays, the particular low-traffic stillness of a church building on a Saturday morning, the smell of cardboard from the donated boxes, the fluorescent hum overhead, the specific satisfaction of filling a shelf from a nearly empty one. I stocked those shelves for 19 consecutive months. I watched the pantry serve the community it was built for. If Karma Archives is new to you, subscribe right now. These are the stories that stay with you long after you have heard them, told exactly as they happened, resolved through the specific tools U.S. law provides for exactly this kind of situation, and never dressed up as anything they are not. What comes next in this story required patience, precision, and a Sunday afternoon with publicly available IRS documents. Subscribe and then stay with me. In February of the following year, the pantry ran out. Not partially, completely. The shelves were bare by the second week of the month. Families who came expecting the pantry to be operational were turned away. I was not on the team that week, but I heard about it on Sunday from a woman named Lucille, who had been running the stocking team longer than I had been a member, and who described the experience of turning away a mother with 3 children with a flatness in her voice that was worse than visible distress. Flatness means something has stopped making sense. That following week, I asked the church administrator about the pantry's operating budget, where it came from, why it had been depleted, and what the relationship was between the regular Sunday offering and the mission fund collections. She told me she had passed my question along to Pastor Coles. His response, as she relayed it to me, "Sister Deborah, generous hearts don't ask for a receipt. The mission fund is moved by the Holy Spirit, and so is the giving that sustains it." I sat with that sentence for the rest of the day. Something in it bothered me in a way I could not immediately locate, not the spiritual framing itself, but the specific move of answering a question about a budget with a statement about the character of asking. A question about money had been returned as a comment about faith. Those are not the same response. The following Sunday, Pastor Coles addressed the shortfall from the pulpit. He described it as a moment of testing. He said the congregation's generosity had been a witness, but that current pantry needs exceeded available resources, and that God was calling the church to a deeper level of faithfulness. He announced a special giving drive for the following month and closed the subject. The drive collected $11,300. The pantry restocked in March. I gave $1,200 extra that February on top of my regular monthly giving. I want to be specific about that number. $1,200 additional dollars toward a ministry I had been personally stocking every third Saturday in the month it ran out of food because a man at a pulpit told me the community's faithfulness was being measured. I wrote that check with complete sincerity, in the same spirit I had written every check before it, without suspicion, without question, without understanding that I was responding to a story that had been professionally calibrated to produce exactly that response. The Escalade I noticed in April of the following year. Raymond Coles had driven a black Cadillac Escalade since before I joined the church. It was a substantial vehicle, the kind that suggests a specific comfort with visible prosperity, but not one I had examined closely. It was simply part of the landscape. His car. The parking space nearest the entrance. The particular sound of it arriving on Sunday mornings. What I noticed in April was that it was new. Not detailed, new. Different plates. The clean, unmarked quality of a vehicle that has never been in a parking lot. New car smell detectable from 6 feet when the window is down. I am a school counselor. I notice changes in pattern before I have a theory for them. I registered it and moved on. In October of that same year, it was new again. 2 Escalades in approximately 12 months. A 2022 Cadillac Escalade Premium carried a sticker price of $76,400. 2 of them in roughly 18 months, parked in the closest space to the entrance of a church whose food pantry had been bare in February and whose congregation had been told that God was assessing their generosity. I mentioned it to Marcus Webb on a Sunday in November, quietly, as we were leaving the parking lot after service. Marcus is 54 years old, a CPA with a practice in Marietta who had attended Grace Covenant for 11 years, longer than I had been in the state. He was the kind of person who listened to everything carefully before responding, which I had always read as seriousness of character, and which turned out to be both that and something else entirely. The particular stillness of someone who already has a thought they have not yet said aloud. He looked at the Escalade. Then he looked at me. "Have you ever read a 990? He asked. I had not. I did not know what a 990 was. A Form 990 is the annual information return that every 501c3 tax-exempt organization in the United States is required to file with the IRS and, critically, required to make available for public inspection upon request. It details the organization's revenue, expenses, officer compensation, and program activities. It is not a private document. It exists specifically so that donors and the public can evaluate how a nonprofit is actually deploying its resources. Marcus had wanted to read Grace Covenant's 990 for 3 years. He had not done it alone because he did not want to become the congregant examining the pastor's finances without cause. What I had given him by saying what I said in the parking lot was cause, or at least the company that makes a question feel less like an accusation and more like 2 people asking together. We requested 4 years of Grace Covenant's 990 forms through the IRS Public Access portal the following week. They arrived as downloadable PDFs in 72 hours. Marcus sat at my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in December, yellow legal pad, laptop, the specific focused quiet he brought to every client file. I sat across from him with a pen and my own notepad. We read. The first thing Marcus noted was the compensation line. Raymond Coles was drawing $112,000 annually from the church's operating account. High for a congregation of Grace Covenant size, but within the range of what a senior pastor at a mid-sized suburban Atlanta evangelical church might receive. Documented. Disclosed. On the form as it should be. The second thing Marcus noted was what was absent. The mission fund appeared nowhere on any of the 4 990 forms. Not as a sub-account. Not as a designated program fund. Not under Program Service Accomplishments, the section of the 990 where nonprofits describe and account for their specific ministry activities. For years of mission fund giving drives. For years of mission fund envelopes and First Sunday collections. For years of a display board in the church lobby showing a photograph of a school foundation being poured in Kenya, with a running donation total updated quarterly in red marker. The mission fund did not appear on a single document Grace Covenant had filed with the federal government. Marcus set down his pen. He looked at the 4 forms laid out in sequence on my kitchen table. Then he looked at me and said something I have thought about many times since, because of how precisely it described what we were reading. Deborah, a 990 is not optional and it is not partial. If a fund existed inside this organization, it is on this document. If it is not on this document, the fund did not exist inside this organization. I asked him what that meant for the money. He said, it went somewhere else. I need you to pause here for a moment, because I want to ask you something before I tell you what came next. Have you ever trusted an institution completely, a church, a school, a nonprofit, an employer, and then sat in a room and watched a document tell you that the version of events you had been given was not what actually happened? If you have been in that specific moment, where evidence resolves the story you were told into something unrecognizable, I want to know what you did in the first hour. Tell me in the comments whether you confronted it immediately, or whether you did what Marcus and I did. Because how you respond in that first hour shapes everything that follows. And what happened in the 11 months after my kitchen table that December became a federal investigation that recovered money for 312 families who had never known they were being taken from. We did not confront Raymond Coles. I want to be direct about that. We did not walk into his office, send a letter to the church board, or speak to any other congregant. Both Marcus and I had enough professional experience, his in financial compliance, mine in working with families navigating institutional harm, to understand that confronting someone before your documentation is complete is the single most reliable way to give them time to close the accounts you have not yet identified. We kept attending Sunday services. We kept sitting in the same worn burgundy cushions. We kept singing the same hymns. And in the evenings, we built the file. Marcus filed a public records request with the Georgia Secretary of State's office for all LLCs registered under Raymond Coles's name and under his wife's maiden name, Renata Coles née Patterson. The request returned 3 entities: Covenant Global Ministries LLC, registered in 2018 with Coles as sole registered agent, Global Harvest Partners LLC, registered in 2020, and a third LLC registered in Patterson's name, dissolved in 2021. Covenant Global Ministries LLC used a business address matching the church building on the public filing, but corresponded to nothing on any of Grace Covenant's 990 forms. A private LLC is not a 501c3. Donations made to a private LLC are not tax-deductible, carry no nonprofit financial disclosure requirement, and are not required to be used for any stated charitable purpose. They are the financial property of whoever owns the LLC. Raymond Coles had been collecting donations in envelopes labeled Mission Fund, presented from the pulpit as contributions to a church-run charitable ministry with an accountability structure, and depositing them into a private LLC account. For 4 years. We also obtained the church's internal offering count sheets through a trusted member of the volunteer counting committee who had grown quietly uncomfortable with what she had been observing. Those sheets recorded, week by week, the amount counted from the Mission Fund envelopes. For years of counting records, cross-referenced against the 990's program revenue figures, showed a gap that required no accounting degree to read. The 990 reported the church's total revenue accurately. The Mission Fund money was not in that revenue total. It had never entered the church's financial system. Marcus filed IRS Form 13909, the tax-exempt organization complaint, in January. The documentation package included the 990 forms, the LLC registration records, the counting committee sheets, and a 12-page narrative summary organized by tax year. Each section mapped what had been publicly represented to donors against what appeared in the IRS filings and what appeared in the Georgia Secretary of State's business registry. The summary said what it needed to say without embellishment because the evidence said it already. The same week, we filed a parallel complaint with the Georgia Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, which holds jurisdiction over charitable solicitation fraud under Georgia law. Same package. Certified mail. Both sent the same afternoon. We told no one at the church. In March, I received a call from an IRS criminal investigations special agent named David Hollins. He told me the Form 13909 had been reviewed and a criminal investigation opened. He asked about the offering counting process, how the mission fund had been presented to the congregation, and whether I had personal records of my contributions. I told him I had every bank statement and every canceled check going back to my first month at Grace Covenant. He said that was helpful. 3 weeks after that call, Coles reached out to me directly. He asked if I could come by the church that week for a private conversation. I agreed and made an appointment for Thursday. I did not keep it. I reported the call to David Hollins on Monday morning. He advised no further direct contact and gave me a case reference number for any subsequent communication. Coles sent a text message to my personal phone on a Sunday evening in April. 7 sentences. The relevant portion: what you're describing is a spiritual attack on this ministry. The enemy uses doubt as a weapon, and I will not allow suspicion to divide what God has built here. I forwarded it to David Hollins within the hour. The investigation ran for 9 months. I want to describe those months accurately because they did not feel dramatic from the inside. They felt like a waiting room. I returned to my counseling work 5 days a week. Marcus continued his accounting practice. We answered investigator questions, sent requested documents, and on Sundays we kept sitting in the same building and singing the same hymns and watching Raymond Coles preach from the same pulpit. Not to observe him. Because leaving before the process was complete would have changed the texture of things in ways neither of us could predict, and the process required stability from us. The forensic audit the IRS Criminal Investigation Division conducted was thorough and specific. Every first Sunday offering collection designated for the mission fund had been counted by Grace Covenant's volunteer committee and recorded on their sheets. Then, rather than being deposited into a church operating account, the physical envelope contents had been transported separately, deposited by Coles personally into the Wells Fargo business account registered to Covenant Global Ministries, LLC. The deposits matched the counting committee records with a precision that, investigators later told us, made the case unusually clean. He had not attempted to obscure the deposit pattern. He had simply counted on the fact that no one was comparing the two sets of numbers. Total documented deposits to the LLC over 4 years, $647,380. Of that amount, documented expenditures included 2 Cadillac Escalade purchases totaling $152,800, $114,000 in personal travel across 17 trips, and recurring cash withdrawals averaging $8,400 monthly. A remaining sum, the investigators did not disclose the exact figure during the active case, had been transferred to the Cayman Islands account. And the school in Kenya whose photograph had lived on the church lobby display board for 4 years? Investigators contacted the Kenyan nonprofit whose name appeared on the display. No affiliation with Grace Covenant Fellowship. No funds ever received from Raymond Coles or from Covenant Global Ministries, LLC. The photograph had been pulled from that organization's publicly available website. The school existed. Coles had nothing to do with it. In September, Raymond Coles was indicted on federal counts of wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, mail fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1341, tax evasion, and money laundering. The wire fraud counts attached specifically to the electronic transfers from the LLC account to the Cayman Islands institution funds transmitted across international lines to conceal the proceeds of a years-long charitable solicitation fraud. The week the indictment was unsealed, Coles appeared before the congregation on a Sunday morning and delivered what I can only describe as a sermon about his own innocence. He stood at the pulpit in the room with the exposed wooden beams and the choir on the eastern wall and the worn burgundy cushions, and he told 300 people that what was being done to him was persecution. He said that federal scrutiny of his ministry was exactly what the enemy deployed against ministries that were making an impact. He asked the congregation to fast, pray, and continue their financial support. Then he looked directly at me, in my pew near the middle of the room, and said, "You wanted the government about a church. You chose Caesar over God. Whatever happens from here is on your hands." 300 people turned to look at me. I sat very still. I thought about the food pantry in February, the bare shelves, the families Lucille had turned away, the mother with 3 children. The extra $1,200 I had written from my own account in the month that ran out because a man at a pulpit told me my faithfulness was being measured. I thought about 312 families who had put mission fund envelopes in a basket every first Sunday of the month for 4 years. I thought about the display board in the lobby and the photograph of a school foundation being poured in a country where not $1 of those $647,000 ever arrived. I did not say anything. Nothing I could have said in that room was more persuasive than what was already in the federal file. Raymond Coles entered a guilty plea to 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of tax evasion in December. The Department of Justice recovered $431,000 through asset forfeiture and the liquidation of the Cayman account. He was sentenced to 41 months in federal prison in February. The IRS permanently revoked Grace Covenant Fellowship's 501c3 tax-exempt status in the same month, effective retroactively across the 4 years of the mission fund fraud, which meant that every donor who had claimed a charitable deduction for mission fund contributions received a letter from the IRS with amended filing instructions, including me. The church dissolved as a legal entity within 60 days of the revocation. A portion of the congregation, approximately 140 families, led by Deacon James Calloway, who had cooperated fully with investigators, reconstituted under a new name, with an independent financial oversight committee and mandatory quarterly 990 filings posted publicly on the organization's website. The food pantry reopened in August under the reconstituted congregation. I was on the stocking team the first Saturday it ran again. Same fluorescent hum overhead. Same smell of cardboard. Same satisfaction of filling a shelf from a nearly empty one. The pantry budget is now itemized, disclosed, and publicly available on the organization's current 990. In 3 years of operation under the new governance structure, it has not run out of supplies once. It took some of the families who depended on it nearly 2 full years to trust it again without hesitation. Lucille told me this. Some of them came cautiously at first, the particular caution of people who have learned that what a building offers and what it actually provides are not always the same thing. I do not judge that. I understand precisely where it comes from, because I sat in that building for 3 years and trusted completely, and I know what it costs to rebuild a version of trust that has been used against you. I have thought a great deal about the specific mechanism by which a fraud built on spiritual community operates differently from other kinds. With financial fraud, the lever is money, fear of loss, or hope of gain. With workplace fraud, it is professional vulnerability. But a fraud built on faith uses something with no natural defense, the part of a person that wants to believe the most generous interpretation of what they're being told. The part that reaches toward meaning and toward the particular warmth of a room full of people who have chosen the same thing at the same time. Raymond Coles understood that lever with precision. He pulled it deliberately for 4 years. What he miscalculated was the 990. Not because he forgot it existed, I do not believe he forgot. I believe he counted on the fact that most donors do not know a Form 990 exists, and even fewer know it is publicly available to anyone who asks for it. He was right about nearly all of the congregation. He was not right about Marcus Webb. I want to say this plainly, because it is the most practically useful thing the story contains. Every 501c3 nonprofit in the United States, every church, food bank, school foundation, medical charity, and community organization operating with tax-exempt status is required by law to file a complete financial disclosure with the federal government and to make it available upon request. The document is called a Form 990. It is 12 pages. It is available through the IRS Public Access Portal in 72 hours or less, at no cost, to any member of the public. The Program Activities section will tell you whether the fund you donated to exists as a legal program. The Compensation section will show you what the leadership is being paid. The balance sheet will show you whether the money you gave is where you were told it was going. It is public information. It is your money. Request the form. The next video I want you to watch on Karma Archives is already on the channel. It is called I Checked Mom's Care Log Against Her Bill. 94 charges weren't real. It is the story of a woman who spent 14 months paying $11,400 a month to a memory care facility and discovered, by requesting itemized billing statements no one expected her to read, that 94 of the line items described care that was never delivered. Same process. A completely different institution. The same fundamental truth about what documentation does when someone has been counting on you not to look. It is on the channel now. Before you leave, tell me something in the comments. Have you ever given money to an organization on the basis of trust and later discovered the trust was misplaced? Or have you been part of a community where someone in authority used that position to take something from the people who believed in them? Tell me what you did with that and when. I read every one. Subscribe to Karma Archives if you have not yet. These stories are here every week, documented, resolved, and told by people who stayed curious longer than the fraud expected them to be. My name is Deborah Mercer. I am 46 years old. The pantry shelves are full.